It was a typical Friday morning in Warner Robins, Georgia, November 24, 2023, the day after Thanksgiving. But at 2:2 Wake Forest Drive, something was terribly wrong. At 9:10 a.m., a calm voice called 911 to report what appeared to be a suicide. The caller was 57-year-old Brian McManus, and he claimed to have just returned from walking his dog to find his wife, 63-year-old Lucille and McManus, dead from what he described as an obvious self-inflicted gunshot wound. But when police arrived at the scene, there was no gun, no shell casings, and the woman they found lying across the bed had been beaten with such savage brutality that it would become clear this was no suicide at all. This was murder, and the man who reported it was about to become the prime suspect in one of the most calculated and cold-blooded killings in Georgia's recent history. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Miss N. That's what they called Lucille and McManus, a woman whose kindness radiated from her front porch on Wake Forest Drive. At 63, she had lived through loss and heartbreak, but she'd never let it dim her generous spirit. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who'd wave enthusiastically from her garden when neighbors passed by, and who treated her granddaughter, Jessica Terrell, more like a daughter than anything else. Warner Robins is a quiet community of around 80,000 people nestled about 10 miles from Robins Air Force Base in central Georgia. It's the kind of place where violent crime is rare and where neighbors genuinely care about one another. For Miss N, it had been the perfect place to create a multi-generational family home. She shared her house with Jessica and 2 great-grandchildren, creating a bustling household filled with the sounds of family life. Miss N had been widowed for several years, and whilst she found immense joy in her role as family matriarch, there was an unmistakable loneliness that crept in during quiet moments. She was a woman who had lived a full life, who had loved deeply, but who still believed that there might be room for companionship in her golden years. She wasn't looking for dramatic romance or grand gestures. She simply wanted someone to share morning coffee with, someone to watch television with in the evenings, someone to accompany her on the small adventures that make life meaningful. Those close to her said Miss N was trusting, perhaps to a fault. She saw the good in people and believed that most folks were fundamentally decent. It was this trusting nature, this belief in human goodness, that would ultimately make her vulnerable to a predator who saw her loneliness as an opportunity to exploit. In 2022, at the age of 61, Miss N made a decision that millions of people her age were making across the country. She decided to try online dating. She joined Tinder, uploaded a few photos, and began cautiously exploring the possibility of finding love again. She had no way of knowing that this decision would eventually cost her everything. When Miss N's profile appeared on Brian McManus's phone screen, he saw exactly what he was looking for. Not love, not companionship, but opportunity. At 55, Brian presented himself as a distinguished British gentleman with an impressive background in law enforcement. He told Miss N that he had served for 17 years as a police officer with the London Metropolitan Police, suggesting a man of honor and integrity. What he didn't tell her was why his police career had ended. Brian McManus had been dismissed from the Metropolitan Police after multiple women complained that he made them feel sexually threatened. The complaints had been serious enough to end his law enforcement career in disgrace, but none of this appeared on his Tinder profile. Instead, he crafted a persona designed to appeal to exactly the kind of woman Miss N was. Someone seeking stability, respectability, and genuine affection. Their online conversations quickly progressed to phone calls, then to in-person meetings. Brian was charming in the way that skilled manipulators often are. He knew exactly what to say, exactly how to present himself to seem like the answer to Miss N's prayers. He spoke of wanting a fresh start in America, of looking for someone special to share his life with, of building something meaningful together. What Miss N didn't realize was that this wasn't Brian's first attempt at using marriage for immigration purposes. He had previously been married to a woman in Idaho, but that relationship had ended in divorce after he was arrested for domestic violence. The pattern of using and discarding women was already well established, but Brian was careful not to reveal any of this to his new target. The courtship moved with surprising speed. Within just 3 months of meeting online, Brian had proposed marriage to Miss N. For a woman who had perhaps given up hope of finding love again, It felt like a fairy tale romance. Here was this worldly, sophisticated man who claimed to adore her, who wanted to build a life with her, who seemed to represent everything she had been hoping to find. In 2022, they were married. Brian moved into the family home on Wake Forest Drive, instantly becoming part of a household that included not just Miss and, but also Jessica and the 2 great-grandchildren. From the outside, it might have looked like a modern blended family finding happiness together. But even from the beginning, there were signs that something wasn't quite right. Multiple witnesses who knew the couple would later testify in court that the marriage appeared to be specifically arranged for Brian to obtain his green card and secure permanent residency in the United States. The timing was suspicious. Brian pushed for marriage unusually quickly, and his demeanor seemed to change once the paperwork was filed. But Miss N, trusting and hopeful as she was, chose to see the best in her new husband rather than question his motives. Once Brian had established himself in Miss N's home, and his path to permanent residency seemed secure, his true nature began to emerge. The charming British gentleman who had wooed her online started to reveal himself as something much darker and more calculating. Brian began taking frequent trips to Florida, claiming they were required for business purposes. He would pack a bag, kiss Miss N goodbye, and disappear for days at a time, leaving her to wonder why his work demanded such extensive travel. He was vague about the details, offering only brief explanations about meetings and business opportunities that required his presence in another state. But Brian wasn't in Florida for business. He was there to visit his mistress. The woman Brian was secretly involved with was also married, making their affair a double betrayal that demonstrated his complete lack of regard for the sanctity of marriage or the feelings of the women in his life. For months, Brian maintained this elaborate deception with the same cold calculation that had characterized his approach to the marriage itself. He would return from these trips and slip back into the role of devoted husband, telling Miss N he loved her, participating in family dinners, playing the part of a man committed to building a life with her. But it was all performance. District Attorney Eric Edwards would later describe Brian's behavior during this period as that of a serial liar and con man who viewed the women in his life as nothing more than disposable objects to be used for his own purposes. During this time, those closest to Miss N began to notice subtle changes in Brian's behavior. Jessica Terrell later recalled that he seemed increasingly distant at family gatherings. He would often withdraw from conversations, appearing uncomfortable when expected to engage naturally with the family he had supposedly joined. There was something unsettling about his presence in their home. Though no one could have predicted the true extent of his deception or the danger he represented, Brian's pattern of behavior with women was becoming clearer to investigators who would later piece together his history. The dismissal from the Metropolitan Police after sexual harassment complaints. The failed marriage in Idaho that ended with a domestic violence arrest. The calculated targeting of Miss N for immigration fraud. Each relationship followed the same template. Brian would identify vulnerable women, exploit their trust and emotions for his own gain, and then discard them when they were no longer useful to him. What made Brian particularly dangerous was his ability to maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously while appearing completely normal to those around him. He was what prosecutors would later call a textbook narcissist who thinks he is the smartest man in the room. This arrogance would ultimately contribute to his downfall, but not before it cost Miss N her life. The most chilling aspect of Brian's deception was how completely he had integrated himself into Miss N's world. He knew her routines, her vulnerabilities, her daily patterns. He had access to her home, her family, her entire life. When the time came to silence her permanently, he would use all of this intimate knowledge against her. November 2023 marked the beginning of the end for Brian's carefully orchestrated deception. It was during this month that he made a mistake so careless, so revealing of his true priorities that it would ultimately cost Miss N her life. In what can only be described as a moment of arrogance-induced carelessness, Brian accidentally sent Miss N a text message that had been intended for his mistress in Florida. The message was intimate, affectionate, and made it immediately clear that Brian was involved in a serious romantic relationship with another woman. For Miss N, receiving this text must have felt like the ground shifting beneath her feet. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with her heart and her home, was not only having an affair, He was having an affair that appeared to be far more emotionally significant than his relationship with her. But Miss N was not a woman to suffer in silence or to simply accept betrayal without consequences. She confronted Brian about the affair, demanding explanations and expressing the pain and anger that any betrayed spouse would feel. The confrontation was heated with Miss N making it clear that she felt utterly deceived and manipulated. It was during this confrontation that Miss N made the decision that would seal her fate. In her anger and heartbreak, she told Brian that she was going to report their marriage to the immigration authorities as a sham. She threatened to expose the fraud that their entire relationship had been built upon. For Brian, this threat represented nothing short of catastrophe. If Miss N followed through on her threat, he would face immediate deportation back to the United Kingdom. His green card, which had been the entire purpose of their marriage, would be revoked. But rather than face the consequences of his deception, rather than accept responsibility for the web of lies he had woven, Brian began to contemplate something unthinkable. In his mind, the problem wasn't his behavior or his fraudulent marriage. The problem was Miss N herself. She had become an inconvenience, a threat to his plans. And in Brian's worldview, inconvenient women were disposable. The transformation from husband to potential killer didn't happen overnight, but it happened with the same cold calculation that had characterized every other aspect of Brian's relationship with Miss N. He began to plan her murder. At 9:10 a.m. on November 24, 2023, the Warner Robins Police Department received a 911 call that would expose one of the most calculated murders in Georgia's recent history. The caller was Brian McManus, and his voice was eerily calm as he reported what he claimed was his wife's suicide. "I've just come back from walking the dog," Brian told the operator, "and I found my wife dead. It looks like an obvious self-inflicted gunshot wound." When Detective Carmen Thompson and Detective Elizabeth Smith arrived at 202 Wake Forest Drive, they found Brian waiting in the front garden. His demeanor immediately struck them as unusual. Here was a man who claimed to have just discovered his wife's tragic death. Yet, he showed no visible grief, no shock, no emotional distress whatsoever. Brian repeated his story with mechanical precision. He had taken the family dog for a routine morning walk, and when he returned around 9:00 a.m., he had found Miss N dead in their bedroom. He claimed she had shot herself, though he couldn't explain where the gun might have gone. As the officers entered the house, they immediately knew something was wrong. Miss N's body was found lying naked across the bed with massive head injuries that were completely inconsistent with a gunshot wound. There was no gun anywhere in the house. No shell casings, no gunpowder residue. What they found instead was a scene of overwhelming violence. Blood covered the walls and ceiling in patterns that suggested a prolonged and brutal attack. The injuries to Miss N's head were so severe that it was clear she had been beaten repeatedly with a heavy object. More troubling was Brian's behavior as officers processed the scene. Rather than showing concern for his deceased wife or asking about the investigation, he seemed primarily focused on whether he was being considered a suspect. When officers pointed out fresh scratch marks on his arms, Brian claimed he hadn't noticed them and couldn't explain how they had gotten there. The scene told a clear story of violence, but one crucial piece was missing: the murder weapon. Officers could see that Miss N had been bludgeoned with a heavy object, but whatever had been used to kill her was nowhere to be found in the house. The killer had clearly disposed of it somewhere, and without it, proving murder would be more challenging. Detectives knew they needed to find that weapon to build their case. So, Detective Thompson and Detective Smith immediately launched what would become one of the most comprehensive investigations in Houston County history. It was clear from the scene that this was no suicide, and Brian's story had more holes than Swiss cheese. The first major breakthrough came when investigators spoke to neighbors. One neighbor reported seeing Brian walking his dog that morning, but noted that his route had taken him to a drainage ditch near the house, an unusual detour from his normal walking path. Security cameras from around the neighborhood were collected, and when investigators reviewed the footage, they made a startling discovery. The cameras showed Brian's movements on the morning of November 24th with perfect clarity. At around 8:45 a.m., Brian could be seen leaving the house with the dog, walking directly to the drainage ditch, disposing of items in the water, and then returning home. Less than 30 minutes later, he was calling 911 to report his wife's suicide. When investigators searched the drainage ditch, they found exactly what they expected: a rubber mallet covered in blood and a cell phone that Brian had attempted to destroy. The rubber mallet would prove to be the murder weapon used to bludgeon Miss N to death. The autopsy conducted by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation provided official confirmation of the brutality Miss N had endured. She had died from blunt force trauma to the head and manual strangulation. Her injuries were devastating. Perhaps most significantly, the autopsy revealed that Miss N had fought desperately for her life. Blood found under her fingernails was tested and found to match Brian's DNA. This explained the fresh scratch marks that officers had observed on Brian's arms. They were defensive wounds left by Miss N as she struggled against her attacker. As investigators dug deeper, they confirmed their suspicions about Brian's motive. FBI cell phone data revealed his business trips to Florida were actually visits to his married mistress. The breakthrough came when they learned Brian had accidentally sent Miss N a text intended for the other woman. Jessica Terrell confirmed that Miss N had discovered the affair and planned to report their marriage to immigration authorities as fraud. This gave Brian the motive he needed to kill. Facing deportation back to the UK, where his law enforcement career had ended in disgrace. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence, Brian began changing his story in increasingly desperate attempts to deflect suspicion from himself. Each new lie was more elaborate than the last, and each was systematically dismantled by the thorough investigation being conducted. Brian's first alternative explanation was perhaps the most cruel. He suggested that Miss N's granddaughter, Jessica Terrell, and her boyfriend might have been responsible for the murder. This wasn't just an attempt to avoid responsibility. It was a calculated attack on the very family members who were grieving Miss N's loss. But FBI cell phone location data quickly disproved Brian's accusations. The data showed conclusively that both Jessica and her boyfriend were miles away from the house during the time frame when the murder occurred. When his attempt to blame family members failed, Brian shifted to his next prepared story. He suggested that Miss N might have been killed during a home invasion or burglary gone wrong. According to this version, unknown intruders had broken into the house, murdered Miss N for unclear reasons, and then fled without taking anything of value. But this story fell apart immediately upon examination. Investigators found no signs of forced entry anywhere on the property. The security footage provided the final evidence that destroyed Brian's alternative theories. The cameras showed only 2 people present at the house during the relevant time frame: Miss N and Brian himself. There was no evidence of any third party entering or leaving the property at any time. As each of Brian's stories was proven false, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He continued to insist on his innocence while simultaneously changing his account to try to explain away newly discovered evidence. This pattern convinced investigators that they were dealing not with a grieving widower, but with a calculating killer who would say anything to avoid taking responsibility for his actions. With all of Brian's alternative stories disproven, the evidence painted a clear picture of what really happened. Brian had waited for Miss N to finish her morning shower, attacked her with a rubber mallet, and when that didn't kill her immediately, he strangled her with his bare hands. He then methodically cleaned up, disposed of the evidence during his dog walk, and called 911 to report a fake suicide. On November 25, 2023, just 24 hours after the murder, Brian McManus was arrested and charged with malice murder. The trial began on July 7, 2025. Over 6 days, prosecutors presented DNA evidence, security footage of Brian disposing of the murder weapon, and testimony about his pattern of exploiting women. Brian showed no emotion throughout, even when confronted with proof of his violence against Miss N. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Brian McManus guilty of murder. On July 16, 2025, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Judge Edward D. Luke Muir told him, "You basically bashed in the skull of another human being." Brian would never walk free again. The murder devastated Miss N's family. Jessica Terrell told the court, "I can't tell her how sorry I am and how selfish I feel for not eating Thanksgiving lunch with her the day before she was brutally beaten to death." Another granddaughter described Miss N as my beautiful, kind, and loving Mim who was ripped away from my family very brutally by a selfish, cold-blooded monster. The family's pain was compounded by Brian's attempts to blame them for the murder they were grieving. Edwards described Brian as an evil sociopath who views the women in his life as disposable. The case highlighted the vulnerability of older adults seeking companionship and the importance of recognizing predatory behavior in relationships. Lucille and McManus deserved to spend her remaining years surrounded by the family she adored. Instead, she became the victim of a predator who saw her only as a means to an end. We must remember Miss and for how she lived with love, generosity, and the belief in human goodness that while it made her vulnerable to Brian McManus, also made her beloved by everyone who knew her.